And speaking of student presenters, we do have someone who would like to share her work with you all. So please give a round of applause to Cassie Stringer.
Hi, my name is Cassie Stringer, and I'll be presenting this poem to you called Silence. I gather my thoughts and feelings and pack them away in a neat little box. I grab blades and anything sharp to carve the pain within me onto my skin. I yell, I scream, I whimper, but the only thing people hear are the soft voices of mine saying I'm okay. My screams and cries for help sound as if I'm yelling underwater. I'm alive, I'm smiling, but I'm here, but within me I'm drowning, being suffocated by my problems, no escape and no way out. When I look into my reflection, the glass breaks. My thoughts, my beliefs about my looks, my body escapes from within my brain and takes over my vision. Therefore, all I see in the mirror is too skinny, but not skinny enough. All I can see is a big forehead, unsmooth skin, and a monster. In that monster is a 15-year-old girl who wants to be free from her own skin. She shivers from the thoughts of her own body being controlled by another individual. She's silent, she's calm, but in her she's screaming, I don't want to die, I don't want to die, not by the hands of herself. Her skin crawls, her skin rips by the blades that make her feel something. She doesn't cry, she doesn't feel. She looks into her reflection, feels the touch she wanted to forget. The touch that went against her saying no, no. She goes home, she cries, and she finally speaks up. But the silence from others is too loud. The one who doesn't believe her. The one who doesn't believe her cuts deeper than any knife can. This girl was once a 15-year-old girl who wanted to live, who had no monsters. But in that monster is a girl, and in that girl is a neat little box waiting to get unpacked. Thank you.
Oh, I got shivers. Cassie, thank you. Thank you for speaking up. Can we give her another round of applause? That, my friends, is what Writers Expo is all about. That is awesome. Okay, we are going to move on. We have a special guest going from current LHS student to an LHS alum. She is a New York Times best-selling author of not only the Hazelwood series, but recently the young adult novel Our Crooked Hearts. And she has another one coming out in February, happy to announce. Her work has been translated into more than 20 languages already and has been included in the New York Times list of notable children's books. She also happens to be, like I said, a graduate of our fine school. Please welcome Melissa Albert. So I think we're going to start because raise your hand if you have read any of Melissa's work. Okay, I think we're going to have Melissa start again, if you don't mind, reading that passage from the Hazelwood.
Thanks so much, guys, for being here. I'm excited to talk to you today. So The Hazelwood is my debut novel, and it's about a girl whose life has been plagued by continual bad luck. She's moved around the country with her mom, always ahead of some unnamed something that her mom won't talk about. And when she's 17 years old, her grandmother, who is the author of a cult collection of spooky fairy tales, dies. And she and her mother finally stop moving and try to build a life in one place. And then all the creepy stuff that's been happening actually catches up with her, and she realizes that the world behind her grandmother's book of fairy tales is very real and it's out to get her. And I will read the first page and a half. My mother was raised on fairy tales, but I was raised on highways. My first memory is the smell of hot pavement and the sky through the sunroof whipping by in a river of blue. My mom tells me that's impossible. Our car doesn't have a sunroof. But I can still close my eyes and see it, so I'm holding on to it. We've crossed the country 100 times in our beater car that smells like french fries and stale coffee and plasticky strawberries from the day I fed my Tinkerbell lipstick into the slats of the heater vent. We stayed in so many places with so many people that I never really learned the concept of stranger danger. Which is why, when I was 6 years old, I got into an old blue Buick with a red-headed man I'd never met and drove with him for 14 hours straight, plus 2 stops for bathroom breaks and 1 for pancakes, before the cops pulled us over, tipped off by a waitress who recognized my description from the radio. By then, I'd figured out the man wasn't who he said he was, a friend of my grandmother, Althea, taking me to see her. Althea was already secluded in her big house then, and I'd never met her. She had no friends, just fans, and my mother told me that's what the man was, a fan who wanted to use me to get to my grandma. After they determined I hadn't been assaulted, after the red-headed man was identified as a drifter who'd stolen a car a few miles from the place we were staying in Utah, my mother decided we'd never talk about it again. She didn't want to hear it when I told her the man was kind, that he told me stories and had a warm laugh that made me believe deep in my 6-year-old's heart he was actually my father come to claim me. She'd been shown the red-headed man in custody through a one-way mirror and swore she'd never seen him before. For a few years, I'd persisted in believing he was my dad. When we left Utah after his arrest to live for a few months in an artist retreat outside of Tempe, I worried he wouldn't be able to find me again. He never did. By the time I turned 9, I'd recognized my secret belief for what it was, a child's fantasy. I folded it away like I did all the things I didn't need, old toys, bedtime superstitions, clothes that didn't fit. My mom and I lived like vagrants, staying with friends till our welcome wore through at the elbows, perching in precarious places, then moving on. We didn't have the luxury of being nostalgic. We didn't have a chance to stand still until the year I turned 17 and Althea died in the Hazelwood.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for listening.
So a little context. Now, actually, Mrs. Singleton, where'd you go? Okay, so tell us what your students read, just so we know.
They read 2 stories from Tales from the Hinterland. We read The Sea Seller and Hans of the Traveler.
Okay. So
Sorry for the sad endings.
Melissa's first book, The Hazelwood, turned into a second book, turned into the collection of fairy tales that the grandmother in the Hazelwood wrote. Can you talk just quickly about the process and whether or not when you sat down to write this debut novel, you had intentions for book 2 and book 3?
I totally didn't. I just wanted to get something done. So I wrote The Hazelwood, and it did well enough that my publisher asked for a sequel, and based on reader response, they ultimately asked me to write the fairy tale collection as well, which was a really fun, weird challenge. It kind of felt like I wrote myself a writing prompt, like in 2016, which was this table of contents for a story collection that doesn't exist. And then like years later, it's like, here's your prompt, write a fairy tale that suits this title. And it was like just a tight enough, interesting enough writing prompt that I was like into it, and I decided to do it.
Excellent. So we're going to bounce back and forth. I'll ask a question. I'll ask a question that Mrs. Singleton's class came up with, and then we can bounce out to you guys too if you have questions. So just be prepared for that. Let's just start with Callie, Mimi, and Anya. They wanted to know what activities you participated in at LHS, 1. 2, if there were any courses you would recommend to students who want to pursue writing.
So all I did was Slant of Light, which I loved. It was very life-changing, especially because Ms. Tarzinski got me and the whole group into Neil Gaiman. Really, the Sandman comics changed our lives. We made our whole personalities were Neil Gaiman's Sandman comics. It was like a group hypnosis by him. And then the second question was...
any courses you would recommend?
Courses I'd recommend. Oh wait, one more thing. I did audition for a lot of plays and I never got cast, so I'm here. I'm gonna do a monologue for you all and a song from Damn Yankees. Just kidding. So a course I'd recommend would be any kind of introductory fiction course that requires you to share your writing. Like anything that you either have to read it out loud or pass out printouts that people mark up and talk about in class. I've heard the workshop method can be very brutal if someone has a big head and is mean, but it's important too, if you want to be a writer, get over the hump of sharing your work pretty early. Like, I waited for so many years and didn't let anyone look at anything that it was pretty wrenching when I finally did. I would recommend doing that as early as possible to like rip the Band-Aid off.
Do you think that process, even for people who do not want to become professional writers, has any sort of benefit?
I think it punctures your ego in a way that's probably useful in your life, even outside of writing. And I think it teaches you empathy, because you can it teaches you to like clock other people, like see their body language responses when other people are talking about something that's like important to them. It's an interesting thing, and I think you can go in and be the guy who's like, this isn't enough, like da 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 da. But or you can be like someone who's learns how to deal kindly with something someone holds dear.
So we were here at LHS kind of sort of at the same time, and I often wonder, and I'm curious your response to this, if you had to go through high school with social media, do you ever wonder how your life would have changed?
Oh my God, so since we didn't, like we IM'd each other all day, but there was no social media of any kind until I was in college. So I like, my backpack was all laminated pictures of like PJ Harvey and like Billy Childish and all these people I thought were cool. I like put them on my backpack because I had no other way of letting people know anything about me, because I didn't have like a social media page to like show that stuff. So that was embarrassing and dorky enough. I can only imagine with horror what kind of, also I can't dance at all. So I would be a huge failure in any kind of dance content. I don't like that. I don't like the notion. Yeah, it sounds scary. It was fun not knowing what anyone was up to. Everyone was mysterious. Like if you had a crush on someone and you saw them for like 50 minutes and then like 5 minutes in the passing period if you ran really fast and got to the hall they were in. And that's it. They were a total mystery. And that was exciting.
No, it's very true. Mrs. Singleton wanted to know if you have a dancing TikTok account, but I guess we answered that question. So
My dad asked me, he's like, what if we did a Mimi and her dad dance TikTok? And I said no, so that's not existing in this world.
Are you guys still talking then after that?
Yeah. Yes.
Good. Okay, so Ava, Ella, Megan, and Sasha wanted to know if there was anything while you were here at LHS that inspired you to write.
Like being bored in the suburbs. At the time, I thought I was just being bored, but then I put that suburban boredom into like this book and the book I'm working on now. I think boredom is like pretty underrated rather. Just all the driving my car around and like riding my bike around. For some reason, like those are the memories that are strongest to me, is like driving places with my friends, riding my bike with my friends. Something about like transitory state where you can't do anything. It's like inspiring to me.
See, and that makes me wonder again, like what if we had had social media in high school? Are we getting out as much? Are we, I don't know. Anyway. So you started mentioning bands and all of a sudden Ben Folds 5 came into my head, Rockin' the Suburbs. And I'm like, you're rocking the suburbs. Like all your books are taking place in the burbs. So tell us how growing up in this area perhaps influenced you, your writing.
So I think Our Crooked Hearts is like a really good example of like how I was inspired by, it's set half contemporary suburbs, basically Libertyville, Vernon Hills mashup, because I went to school here and grew up in Vernon Hills. And that is all that like suburban boredom and like the David Lynchian creepiness of like parking lots at night and seeing houses, and because like I live in Brooklyn now, and you're constantly seeing like people having full-on fights on the sidewalk and like kids running around on the subway, like everyone's in their faces with their lives. Whereas here, there's like a more congenial atmosphere of like things happen inside your house. It's like, don't let the neighbors hear. But that's creepy, right? Like if you think about it. So that kind of creepiness is very interesting to me. And then the other half of the book is set in 1990s Chicago. And for me, growing up here, there was always that idea of like the city, the place of ultimate cool. And that got in there. Just like that idea of the city is almost like a mythical, like a metaphorical place of, I don't know, something bigger, something better, whatever, that you kind of like long for.
Sounds very suburban, yeah. All right, so we're gonna pause. Any questions already from the audience? Throw your hand up high. Yes, over here.
What encouraged you to start writing?
So I wrote a lot when I was a kid, when I was like, I'm a genius and everything is perfect. And then I got a little older and was like, everything is terrible. I hate my writing. And I went through like a period of decline. And then it was really like being in high school and having the community aspect of Slant of Light. I wanted to hang out with my cool friends who were writing, so I was like, I have to also write. And I was like drawn to it by like wanting to, but it was really like having that kind of social impetus that got me doing it again. And then it wasn't until my 20s when I was doing a lot of freelance work around like young adult fiction development, which I kind of like fell into sideways through some other freelance. I decided that I would write a novel. Like I would give it a try. And it was National Novel Writing Month, which, have you guys heard of that? Maybe? Every November you write a 50,000 word novel and you can like go online and join like this community of other writers. And I thought I would do that, and it was like such a horrible failure. And I thought it would be so easy because I'm a reader. I thought it would just like come out like sounding like a novel. And that was like my first experience with how incredibly bad your writing is and how much you have to forgive yourself for being bad. Because there's this massive gap between like what you know is good and what you're actually capable of doing. So I feel like if you look at your own writing and you know it's bad, it's because you have good taste. It's because you can get better, is what I always tell myself. So like the worse it looks to you, it's just like your excellent taste and skill spurring you on to get better. But some days it just feels like, I'm garbage. But you know, you have to go through a lot of that. So that's my long-winded answer. Oh, and you're the first question asker. Every first question asker gets a free book. So I'll leave this on the end of the stage for you.
And just so y'all know, the community of writers that Melissa's talking about, we do have something kind of like that here at LHS. One avenue, at least, is I forget if we're calling it the Writers Club or the Write Club, something along those lines. But if you're interested, Mrs. LeMaestri, are you here? No. Okay. See Mrs. LeMaestri, because she would be the person to talk to. It's a wonderful, wonderful community to be a part of. Okay, so Partho, Sophia, Clayton, and Shruti were wondering why, and you kind of touched on this a little bit, but why fantasy as opposed to other genres?
So when you start writing something as long as a novel, you're going to be living with it and in it for like so many months. And there's also the fact of having to fill it up with plot. And it turns out I have no plot ideas that aren't like magical. Like the only way I can think to advance a plot or explain an interesting question I want to ask in a book is like magic. It's what I love to read. I grew up, it's almost like become a cliche to say that like I grew up checking the back of wardrobes, right? For like a door to Narnia. But like it is literally true. So I think for a lot of young, weird people who end up doing something that's like storytelling adjacent, whether it's writing or something else, there is that kind of like questioning of reality, like, but maybe magic is real? And like, I think for me that lasted, relatedly, I was quite an awkward young person, but it lasted like well past the age where other kids were, doing things that were not so dorky.
Yeah, well, I never got my letter for Hogwarts either, so, I hear you. So this was just coming to me. I'm curious, particularly with a lot of fantasy writers who get into you've got like occult elements, you have straight up fantasy elements, you've got, more magical kind of things. And if it's too personal, you don't have to answer, but what your beliefs are in terms of some kind of other reality that's out there.
So I'm facing this question a lot now because my kid is 5. And he's like, are monsters real? No. But Santa's real? Oh yeah, yes. And then he's like, are fairies real? I'm like, Santa's kind of a fairy. Yeah, fairies are real. And he's like, what about mermaids? And I'm like, oh my God. So it's this whole thing. So I've started being like, I hope so. So he's like, is magic real? I'm like, I hope so. And that answer is like the truest answer I can give. And I sure hope so. Like, that's all I can say.
I like it. Claire, Lana, Dion, and Vivian were wondering what the hardest part of writing fantasy is.
The hardest part of writing fantasy is that I want to put in all of this cool stuff, but then I have to explain it in a way that's like fairly sound. So you're trying to take all this mystical invented stuff, but create a magic system that grounds it enough in reality that you're not just totally hanging the reader out to dry. Like, I don't want to drag someone through a story, and then at the end I'm like, they were dreaming. That's like the classic example of like bad writerly practice. So it's doing all the cool stuff you want to do and finding the like right magical engine to support it and making it convincing. And like you mentioned Harry Potter, and they're always like, you know, Wingardium Leviosa, and it's like, why? There just seems I like a little more rigor to my magic. Not that I didn't, you know, devour all the Harry Potter books, but I prefer like the Lev Grossman Magician's Trilogy, School of Magic, where they're torturing their minds and bodies to like make magic happen, because that feels more like that could exist, that exists.
And I forget what you said earlier when I asked you a different period, how much research in that regard you had to do on magic for Our Crooked Hearts specifically.
Yeah, so Our Crooked Hearts is a book. I'm forgetting who I've told what. Did I already explain? Did I tell you guys about Our Crooked Hearts yet? Take that as a no. I'll tell you again no matter what. So it's about a young girl. She's living in the suburbs and her summer break has just begun, and all this creepy, bizarre stuff is starting to happen to her. And then her mom, she witnesses her like strange, evasive mother doing something so creepy that it kind of like breaks her life open, and she realizes there's something happening in my life that I've been looking away from forever. And then it's told in tandem with her life and her mother's life in the 90s as she's becoming a witch, and she does something so devastating that it like will shape her daughter's life 25 years later. It's going to come back to mess with them. Having said all that, I've forgotten your question. Oh, research. Yeah. Okay, so when I was 13 years old, I wanted to be a witch. And the way I went about it was I went to Cook Memorial and I checked out other books about witches, really dry nonfiction stuff. And I did my best, but I did not ultimately become a witch as hard as I tried. But I had all of that like fizzy, supernatural stuff kind of hanging out in my brain. And then I read a lot about superstitions because they felt very witch adjacent. And there's such like it's just like superstitions are like death is like threaded through them. And I feel like witchy magic, it's the same thing. So that kind of inspired some of like the motifs and stuff in the book.
Yeah, Reese, Kiernan, Debbie, and Zara were wondering about that kind of gothic, somewhat sinister atmosphere that's present in your writing. If that's really, is it purposeful or does it just kind of come out?
It's what I love to read. I love mood. If I could, I would just write mood and weird magic forever and never explain any of it, but you can't do that.
Well, it comes through in the Tales of the Hinterland. I mean, yeah, never explaining it, it's there, you know.
It's fairy tales.
Yes, it's great. They were also wondering, and you touched on this with another period, the mythologies that you've read and how that's woven into your writing.
Yeah, I just love mythologies from around the world. When I was a kid, I read Robert Lang's colored fairy books, which started with the blue. Then it was like, they ran out of normal colors. It's like the ochre fairy book. But yeah, it's like many, many volumes of fairy tales from around the world. And it's stuff like Cinderella, but like presented also with like a tale you've never heard of from like Uganda. It's wonderful. It's just this great, it just kind of filled up my brain with this like bubbling sedimentary layer of magical practices from around the world that I never kind of got over.
Awesome. All right, we're going to do questions. Yeah, over on the side.
I was just wondering if you have a favorite book or like a favorite author.
Okay, so Lev Grossman's The Magician's Trilogy is a book series that I read again and again. And every time I have writer's block, I read like 10 pages, and that's all it takes to get me to want to write again. And it's this wonderful mix of like, it's like Harry Potter and Chronicles of Narnia, but like mashed into the contemporary life of this like miserable Brooklyn teenager who hates his life, and even magic doesn't fix it, but it's like this like high-low mix of real world and magic, and it's like perfect. And that's that's what I want to write. That's like that's the DNA, I think, of everything I write is that. And Neil Gaiman, Coraline, and The Graveyard Book.
Any others right now? Yes, up front.
Oh, yeah, like for years after I got out of high school. Yeah, it was like I wrote as a kid and then I kind of stopped because I was shy and weird about it and dabbled in it in high school. And then in college, I kind of did like some journalism stuff. I was like, got a journalism degree, so I had to. But yeah, it was like not present in my life. Fiction wasn't for a really long period, I would say. I would say like a period of maybe 5 to 10 years where I didn't really touch fiction. And then it was like in my or maybe like 5 to 8 years. It was in my mid-20s that I like came back to it. So yeah, it's always like waiting for you if you go through a break.
Yeah, go for it.
Was there any career you were like thinking of before like writing?
So I knew I wanted to do something with words because I had no abilities in any other direction. So like I'm a good speller, and I turned that into a job as a copy editor. I was at like Encyclopedia Britannica, but it was like for me it was like an unhappy and boring job. So I started freelance writing, and I was like freelance writing like book reviews and theater reviews and stuff like that, just to kind of like, because I couldn't find a writing job and I wasn't ready for one. And I felt like if I could just keep freelance writing, I could at least like keep getting better in case someday like a writing job opens itself. And I was constantly applying. I thought I'd be an editor in like New York, and I was constantly applying, and like no one would ever even give me an interview. So I came at it kind of weirdly, like I knew I wanted that editing job. I became an editor at a museum, and that is how I ended up moving to New York, which was like my goal. So I was never able to like get a straight line to writing. It was all like, I took any writing or word editing adjacent freelance job I could get. And I was like, something one day will like lead to a job, and that's how it worked out. So I would say like creep around the edges of the thing you want to do if like the straight shot is not open to you, which I don't know how anyone without like a parent, in the field does it. I don't know.
A couple questions have popped up today about writer's block, when you get in those moments of kind of dead periods, and you've talked about going to a museum that's in your neighborhood. I was curious, what type of museum is it?
I live by a museum called the Brooklyn Museum, which is where I used to work, and it is kind of like a general interest art museum, but it's like a neighborhood museum, so it's super approachable, and I don't know, it's just like a cool place to kind of like refill the well, and they have these thing called the period rooms, where they've rebuilt houses, like inside from other times in history, and it's like kind of like dimly lit, and you can like peek in the windows, and it makes you feel like a creepy other century, thief. It's very enjoyable. I love that museum.
So a piece of advice definitely then you would say is, for that type of writer's block thing, go to the places of other people's creativity that can help inspire your own creativity, sort of.
Creep around houses. No, I was kidding. Yeah, that's actually a good way to put it. Go to, and like other people's creative brains, like try to access them in some way. And stay off of the internet. That is what kills me. If I look at the internet in the morning, I half the time I've ruined my work for the day. I try to like make coffee, like turn off put on like my internet blocking software and work. And that's the only way I get things done.
Okay, so Maggie, Julia, Sophia, and Lucas were wondering, this is a great question, how do you know when to end a story?
That is a good question.
Especially with your writing style, because you said you don't necessarily plan the end ahead of time, right? You
Yeah,
just kind of find your way there.
My issue is more, how long should the middle be? Like, I don't know. Like, I feel like you can get a strong feeling for the ending sometimes, and then the middle's like all wibbly wobbly. Also, I like to end it and then get out of there. But readers like that last chapter where you wrap it up. I like that as a reader. I would be mad if it was missing. I do not enjoy writing the wrap-up chapter. I want to just get out of there after the like climactic thing, you know, but that's not allowed. It would be unsatisfying. So I feel like you have to force yourself to write the wrap-up, and that's a struggle for me every time.
Okay, so Eli, Ashley, and Kate were wondering which story, I'm assuming you guys meant in the Tales from the Hinterland, but maybe if you've written other short stories too, which short story you are the most proud of and why?
Oh, the last one in the collection. What's that called though? Oh, the last one in the collection is my favorite. And I don't remember what it's called. And it's like, it's got this opening that's very like Snow White juniper tree. And then it's like, tells a totally different tale after that, which I always love, that like 2-story thing that fairy tales do, where you think you're reading one thing and then you're reading another. Yeah, I love that one. It's got a cat illustration.
They also wanted to know how you keep motivating yourself as a writer.
Reading. The only thing that works for me is reading. Like reading a book that's so cool and interesting that you're like, I want to do that. Or a book that's so not cool and interesting that you're like, I can do better than that. Why am I not finishing my book? I think either. Like you can be driven by wanting to get revenge on the person who said you couldn't do it. Whatever it takes to drive you. I think like there's no such thing as like a purity of like, I only write because my muse tells me to, and I don't believe in that. I don't think it's real, and I know it's not sustainable. It's just like sheer determination, whatever that means, and however ugly it looks, and however stressful, because it's quite stressful. The thing that is interesting to me is a scene that was hell for you, like a scene that writing it, the process was so ugly and painful, and every sentence was like squeezed from a stone. And then you read it, and you can't even tell. Like, it just like is in there, and it's hard to, you like don't see the blood under the nails when you actually read the thing.
Speaking of kind of that work, how long did it take you to finish each of your novels?
Hazelwood I wrote on and off for 2.5 years. I kept taking breaks because I actually wrote novels under pseudonyms for a development house, which, like, I won't talk about those or tell you what they are. They're embarrassing. And then the sequel was a horrible experience to write. It was very difficult. Second book started not fun. I wrote the wrong book for 1.5 years, threw it away, and then wrote the book that it actually became in like 6 months because I'd done the thinking. And then Tales, I don't remember, I wrote it in pieces. And Our Crooked Hearts was the quickest for me. It was like 1 year, and it was during the pandemic. And it was like the happiest place for me to be was this like twisted magical world, because the real world, you know. So that was the best. And now I'm writing a book that's taken too long, but I'm almost done.
More questions from all of you? Yes, right in the middle.
How do you deal with criticism that isn't constructive about like your books and your writing?
That's such a good question because you have to learn the difference. And there's this impulse to read all of your reviews, at least for me, like when my book first came out, because I wanted people to say nice things about me. But there's a difference between, people like will tag me into reviews and they're like, this book was boring. And I'm like, that's not constructive criticism. I don't know you. You try to write a book. I'll wait. Go ahead and write a book. Is always like my feeling. It's really kind of choosing your sources. So if you can avoid your own reviews and like maybe don't look when people tag you and stuff, whatever. And I would say the places I get my most constructive criticism comes from my like team of people, like my friends, my editor. And I do read professional reviews because generally they're a little more, I've never had someone be like, she sucks, in a professional review. And sometimes there will be like a little bit of a, oh, like they have a point. And as I keep on writing, I can see flaws in my earlier books, which is really interesting, like stuff I would edit out if I could. So yeah, it's just about choosing who to trust and who to like open yourself up to, because words that are, unkind can like really stick with you. So
Yes, over here.
How hard is it to like publish and sell books?
say again.
How hard is it to publish and sell books?
Okay, so publishing was, for me, I did a ton of research before, and I was working for Barnes & Noble. I was like running their young adult content arm, and I got to talk to a lot of writers for my job. And just kind of being immersed in that world, I had at least a sense of how it worked to get an agent. So the places that I found myself taking all my notes from were Publishers Weekly's, a trade magazine that announces book deals. So I took notes on which agents were selling books similar to mine, and like had my list of agents I wanted to pitch. And then I followed a website called Query Tracker and Query Shark, which gave you a lot of advice and information on how to write a query letter, which is what they call the letter you write to send to literary agents to like convince them to want to represent your work. So I went the traditional route, and I got an agent that way, and then she sent it out to publishers. And I've had good luck with like a really great supportive publisher. And as far as selling books, like a total crapshoot. You just never know what's gonna work. What'll be a sleeper, what'll be, like if you've ever heard of One of Us is Lying, Karen McManus was an author who, her debut, One of Us is Lying, was just like dropped at a random time. There was like no marketing budget. They didn't send her on any book tour. And then it was like a sleeper hit, massive, like juggernaut. So you just never know. And then other things with like a 6-figure marketing budget disappears. It's a weird industry.
Which one of yours has sold the most? Do you know?
The Hazelwood, yeah, my first one. I don't get really great numbers. Like it's very confusing and bizarre and a mystery. So when people are like, how's your book doing? You're like, I don't know. I don't know.
Other questions? Yes.
Never other than fantasy, but I do want to write adult books as well. So, but it will always have magic. I can't imagine writing without magic.
All right, I hope I'm not missing somebody. If I am, just shout out. Okay, so one of my students who couldn't come to these earlier periods wanted to know if you had any trouble taking characters in a real world setting and suddenly throwing them into this fantastical realm.
Oh, I love that question. No, I love doing that. And it's, again, comes back to like Lev Grossman's Magicians. It was like, how do real people react when actually faced with magic? I just find that like kind of friction so interesting. And it's one of the things I love to write about.
So I thought this was kind of interesting. Another one of my students wanted to know this. It was not this period, I believe, that we talked about rabbits, was it? It was an earlier period? Okay, so our Crooked Hearts, rabbits have kind of a central role. You can even kind of see from the book cover there. And yeah, one of my students was like, why rabbits? And I thought, that's a great question.
Can I tell the story? Okay, so I was living in Chicago, this was like 15 years ago, and someone in my neighborhood was beheading birds and then putting sticks in a cross on their body with their wings out, which to me looked like the occult, and I was gonna get murdered. So I called 311, which is like the city non-emergency line, and the person on the other end of the line was like, that's occult, you gotta call 911. And I was like, you're right, I'm gonna call 911. So I called 911, and the woman was like, this is you got a dead bird? She's like, try animal control. So that image of like this super occulty like bird murder stuck in my head. It was too creepy. I did not want to put it in the book. But when I just did a dead bird, it was not impactful enough. You see dead birds all the time. So I made this, it's one of the first sort of things that happens to my modern day protagonist in our Crooked Hearts that lets her know there's some like creepy stuff happening, is she finds a beheaded rabbit on her driveway. And that's sort of like one of the first signs that her life is about to become real weird.
Yeah. Okay, so in some sense, you've already done this because your books take place in the suburbs that are kind of like Vernon Hills and Libertyville. But I'm going to put you on the spot. If you had to set a story in a real place around town here, where would it be?
The Denny's closed. Okay. I
Tell
mean,
the story about the Denny's, though. I thought that was cool.
oh yeah. So my friends and I did something we called Denny's Day, where we stayed in a Denny's for the whole like time. Is it 24 hours? I forget now how we did it. But we stayed there and we like took over the smoking section back when there was a smoking section. And then we had our friends like visit us throughout the day. So it was like a procession of, you know, people, and we had it was like a great day. It was just like a great way to like, I don't know. It was like being in Jane Austen novel, but like the Denny's was your sitting room and people would visit you. So that was a really good day. And we would park our cars in a circle in like the lot between the Denny's and the mall, so we could put our headlights on and like have a party in the middle. I just like the ingenuity of having nowhere to go. So like we had nowhere to go unless someone's parents were out of town. So we like created spaces we could go to. So I guess I would set a book in like one of those spaces you create, or like transform to your liking.
How do you feel about the fact that the mall is basically being destroyed to create condos?
So the mall is not what it was. Like when I was a kid, there was like a fountain and a natural wonders, and you could like buy a rock. It was a very cool rock store. And you would, at least when you were in like 6th grade, you'd walk around and see people you knew. Less in high school, but it's sad. It's sad to go to the mall now. It bums me out.
Okay, I want to give you guys a chance. Make sure we hit anyone. Yeah, up here somewhere. Go ahead, shout it out.
Do you outline your life stories? If you do, how long do they take?
Sadly, I don't, and I want to have a better process and outline, but I just like write them in order, and then inevitably the editing process takes longer than the writing. So I would like to outline, but so far I do it in order while taking tons of notes, like as I go and what I think is going to happen. But there has to be a better way. If I outline, I feel less excited about the book. If I just draft, I take ages. I'm gonna try to find a happy medium, but I haven't found it yet. Thank you, everybody. Have a good one.